Good morning, everybody. Anthony here. Nice to be here, and I'm glad that you're here too. Glad you could make it. Well, do we know anything about the world before the flood or any people? Well, let's find out the little that we do know about this topic. Canaan before the flood. He's not to be confused with Canaan after the flood or Cain. 3789 BC to 2879 BC. So let's dive into history with our periodic table of history time machine. And that is our time machine that allows us to use the periodic table of history to go back in time, and then we try to find time and place these characters in their settings. Now, we don't know much about the pre-flood world, and so the present is not the key to the past. So what we have to do is turn our thinking upside down in this unknown world, and then think about a completely foreign world that is below the Precambrian rock layers in the Grand Canyon. Probably all those sedimentary layers are the layers of the flood and all the massive flooding and turbulence all over the world. We see the sedimentary rock all over the world. And then we're talking about the pre-flood world that's probably right there at the Great Unconformity at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So let's take away all of our preconceived ideas and jump into this topic. Cainan, his name is possessor or acquirer of knowledge. So let's graphically view where he existed at time. At least we can know a little bit about that based upon the Masoretic text. So here is our periodic table of history, and we're going to be primarily looking at this huge taproot because that is the taproot found in the Hebrew record. And we're going to go up here to this very ancient time because we're in the 4th generation, right from the beginning of the world. And also in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about China and the origin over there. And I think those things are very interesting. But let's zoom in because it's always good to be able to see what we're talking about. Is Cainan right here? Yes, he is. Well, I'm going to change the color of this to yellow so we can see it a little bit better. There it is. Yeah, I could almost not see the color there to see it, but now we got it. Cainan, he's also spelled K-E-N-A-N or C-A-I-N-A-N. And there he is, 910-year lifespan. And the reason for that, we get that from the scripture, mostly Genesis chapter 5. There's the scriptures related to that. There's 1 Chronicles, and there's also Luke chapter 3. So I'm putting those up on the screen so we all know the references for that. But that Genesis 5:12 through 14 shows us that Cainan lived to be 910 years old. That is fabulous. Now, apart from the ancient Hebrew history, we go to the 250 BC Book of Jubilees. Parts of this were in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it is more venerated in the Ethiopia and Middle Eastern traditions more than the Western traditions. So we don't hear about the Book of Jubilees very much, but it has a little bit extra detail that we don't see in the Masoretic text. And one of the things we see here, Jubilees 4:14, kind of interesting. And then the 6th week of the 6th Jubilee, Cainan took Muleleth, his sister, to be his wife, and she bore him a son, and he called his name Mahalalel. So we get Cainan, the wife, and the son right there in that Book of Jubilees. But we don't know the wife's name from the King James Version, so that's kind of an interesting thing. And for more study, we can go to Josephus that mirrors all the names in his great work, The Antiquities of the Jews. Here we have Antiquities 1, 3, and 4 that you can see there. We don't get much more out of that. But one of my favorite curiosities of this time is a speculative link between ancient kings of the pre-flood era, as recorded by the Hebrews, and the ones recorded by the Sumerian Kings list. So let's go to our periodic table of history. Move over just a little bit. See, I'm going to zoom in here so that we can see the first kings of Eridu. That's pre-flood Samaria. That's who they have recorded before the flood. And let's go down a little bit farther, because there are 9 kings in the Sumerian kings list and 10 in the Bible. So that means they're missing one, and so we can be off when it has a sequence 1 through 9. Somebody is missing. So we can zoom in here and see the name of some of these kings. So at least we have a chance to think maybe this guy is in Min Galaana. Perhaps he is. Perhaps he's in Min Luana. And then we might be able to even go a little bit farther down in Sipad Zidana. We don't really know who he is and if he correlates. It's just really interesting speculation to make the connection between the Sumerian kings list, 9 kings before the flood, and the Hebrew record that has 10 kings before the flood. That is an amazing curiosity to me, I guess. And something that's really interesting in the Sumerian kings list is there are 8 kings before Utanapishtim. And what do we know about him? Well, he is the Sumerian name for Noah and the survivor of the Great Flood, according to the Akkadians. And he is the one that Gilgamesh is searching for, that survived the flood and knows about how to have a long life. So if you know about the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Sumerian myths, they are very interesting when we do a comparative analysis between them and the Hebrew record. So there is some amazing curiosities to do. Here is the photo, public domain photo of that Sumerian kings list. That is where we get a lot of our written in stone information from the Middle East. But 910 years is a long time to live, but long lives were common in the ancient world. And I told you we were going to go to China, so let's zoom out just for a second so we know what we're doing, where we're going. We are going to go up here, like I said, up to China. So you look at how, with our periodic table of history time machine, how fast we can go to these other cultures. We can just zip right up to them, just like that. Okay, and here we have the San Huang Wudi, the 3 sovereigns of China. And the first king is Fuxi. Notice the date and notice the name. It's also Fuxi in Chinese. He reigned for 115 years. That means he was older than that as far as his lifetime. People reigned less than their total lifetime unless they reigned their whole life, right? And so he lived probably way past 115 years old, but reigned for 115 years. So he is an example of someone with a very long lifespan, and we should be familiar with that. Other things that are very intriguing about this era in Chinese history, which I think they are a post-flood civilization because they have information back to the flood. Interesting thing is, Fuxi's wife, his name is Nuwa. Nuwa, well, that sounds a whole lot like Noah to me, but their depiction is Nuwa, and that is the wife of Fuxi. See, so they have the names switched around. You see that? That is very interesting. But Fuxi and Nuwa were credited with repopulating the earth after the flood. Chinese myths. These are Chinese myths. So they used clay to create mankind. Isn't it interesting how if you have a standard and then you compare that with something else, how you can get the cognitive dissonance and then see where something is different than the standard. But they don't have Adam here. They have Nuwa creating the first humans, and creating the first humans out of earth. Isn't that fascinating? Do you pick up the parallels between the Hebrew record and the Chinese record? Well, this depicts Chinese record. It's called the Hua Nanzi. You can look that up, an offshoot work of the Records of the Grand Historian. It was written maybe around 140 BC, but this gives us the flood myths of China. It talks about Fuxi and Nuwa repairing great deals of damage caused by the Great Flood and torrential aftermath flooding, that there were holes in heaven that fell down to earth and destroyed the earth, and the pillars of the earth were broken underneath. Man, that sounds so very familiar to Genesis 1 and 2. But remember to look that work up. That's the Huayinan Z. I'll put that on the screen so that you can look that up if you wish to. Very interesting parallels. And then we go back to that date of Fuxi there. Notice the start date of the first Chinese sovereigns to be 2852 BC. Now, according to the Masoretic text, the flood is 2458 BC. So why is there about, what is that, a 400-year discrepancy between the two? Well, remember I told you, anything before, the dates before 1500 BC are greatly suspect. Remember that, and think of everything as being elastic. We're going to have a standard and we're going to compare something to it. But the farther back in time, we actually have a greater standard deviation and a greater stretchability to the dates. Because the Chinese history were recreated after 200 BC. So it's very difficult for us to say that we have absolute accuracy going back one way or another. So think of the time about 2000 to 3000 BC with a lot of archaeological interpretations and not a lot of absolutes. So think of it as a stretchy time, and then just be comfortable with that, because the farther back in time you go, the less certain we are, and it's just the way it is. Don't base your salvation on the dates. Don't ever do that. Just put your faith in Jesus Christ and the Messiah and be curious and learn. That's what I'm doing here and trying to point out these amazing curiosities. So this topic is fun, it's curious, and it should ground our understanding in some semblance of the past. And we can learn from the mistakes of others, and then we can live a life of fire and victory also. And that's what we want. We want to live in life, not live in death. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope learning about the Sumerian kings list and Chinese kings, that somehow puts a little bit of world perspective on the periodic table of history. And I hope we had a lot of fun just looking at or imagining how it might be in that pre-flood world using our time machine drone that can fly into these ancient civilizations. So you can check out other videos on this channel by clicking the link here above, or you can click on the channel name, which will bring you to a place where you can select from a lot of other videos I have uploaded. I hope you learn a lot, I hope you're enhanced, and I hope you have a great week. Thanks a lot and have a great day. Talk to you in the next video. Goodbye now.